Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty and most merciful God, we remember before you all poor and neglected persons whom it would be easy for us to forget. The homeless and the destitute, the old and the sick, and all who have none to care for them. Help us to heal those who are broken in body or spirit and to turn their sorrow into joy. Grant this, Father, for the love of your Son, who for our sake became poor, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Today we're beginning with the story of Solomon, and I'm going to do it in sort of three movements. If you have been coming to a year of the Bible, you'll remember that at the end of the last time that we gathered, David was having some family problems. Those divisions continue as David moves close to death, and as you might imagine, there is a power struggle, to put it quite bluntly, among David's sons about who's going to be the king. His son Adonijah proclaims himself king. Now, that in and of itself is rather like Napoleon crowning himself the emperor. You were only supposed to be a king if God had anointed you, and either a prophet or a priest was to do that. You weren't to claim that for yourself. So Adonijah is already off on a bad footing. When David hears that Adonijah has done this, he makes it clear to Nathan the prophet. You remember Nathan, who came and spoke to him about Uriah and Bathsheba. He speaks to Nathan and to Zadok the priest and says, no, not Adonijah. I want Solomon to be my successor. So they anoint Solomon, and Solomon, in fact, becomes king. Lest you think that Solomon's a nice guy, he immediately slaughters those who were his rivals. He kills his brother Adonijah. He kills David's brother Shimei. And he kills Joab, who is the commanding general of the army. No rivals is the word really that goes out from that. So this may shake your picture of Solomon, whom most of us, if you attended Sunday school, were probably taught in a kind of lovely way that Solomon was a person who was kind of unselfish and asked God for wisdom instead of for riches or long life, which in fact, according to the text, he does. But he is a mixed bag, like all of us, and he has this, a la my sermon this morning, he has a greedy, power-hungry side, as well as a wise and discerning side. He's not just one or the other, he's both. The quintessential story about Solomon as a wise discerner is an amazing story. Again, if you went to Sunday school, you probably had this story in your childhood. You probably weren't told that the two mothers were prostitutes, but that's what the text says. So, honoring the text, we say that two women who lived in the same household and who were prostitutes each give birth to a son, 4 days apart. One mother rolls over on her son during the night, and he dies. A horrible thing. Place yourself in her position. You can imagine how broken she must have been. But she's not going to let it stop at that, and so while the other mother is still asleep, she switches the babies. She puts the alive son, who is not hers, at her breast and takes her dead son and puts it at the other mother's breast. When that mother wakes up in the morning, she realizes, after looking closely, trying to feed this child who is dead, that this isn't her child at all. And so they go to the king to ask the king to make judgment. You may or may not know, if you read my blog this week, you know this, the verb to discern basically means to cut. It means to cut the truth and falsehood apart. And so there's a wonderful symbol in this story. Solomon comes out with a sword. He's cutting truth from falsehood. And he says, all right, I'm going to cut the baby in half and give each of you half since you can't agree about this. The real mother, of course, out of it, it says her heart is burning with compassion for her son. Says, no, you take him, I'll somehow manage, but don't kill him. Solomon realizes, of course, that that's the real mother, gives the child back to his true mother, and that's the end of the story. Solomon becomes associated in the Jewish tradition, as his father David had been associated with the Psalms. Solomon becomes associated with what's called the wisdom literature, especially the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. In fact, his name appears at the beginning of those books, though if you read carefully what it says, it doesn't necessarily say that he wrote them. It is highly unlikely, I would say, that Solomon wrote either of those books. But what is likely is that because Solomon was building a nation and was drawing figures from all over the Near East, he was probably drawing wisdom figures from Egypt, where a kind of wisdom movement had begun before Solomon's own time, was bringing them, to Israel. And that it's natural that he would be known as, if you will, the father of wisdom literature. Because in that sense, as king, he invited wisdom folks from other cultures, nations, to come and be in Israel. So much for the early part of Solomon's life. Second heading here is about Solomon's temple, his palace, his standing army, and his harem. Those of you who have heard my sermon already will know some of where I got some of my ideas for the sermon. He turns out to be quite a self-aggrandizing and greedy person, and he's oppressive to his people, and he is unfaithful to God. The text says all of this. I'm not making it up. This is not a matter of interpretation. It's right there in the text. It takes 7 years to build the temple. Clearly, a major building, and there's some detailed information about the kinds of things that Solomon is bringing, particularly from Lebanon to the north, called Tyre at that point, to build the temple, like the so-called cedars of Lebanon. He's bringing beautiful wood, he's bringing gold, he's bringing jewels. He's going to make the temple a beautiful building. So far, so good. It sounds good, like he wants to make a beautiful, glorious building for God. But then we find out that though it took 7 years to build the temple, it takes 13 years to build his palace. You can see that it's almost twice as much time, energy, cost to build his own house as to build God's house. So if you're wondering where I got my ideas for my sermon, here we are. In addition to this, he's the first king of Israel to have a standing army. In other words, David had an army that he would gather whenever there was a need, but Solomon decides he wants an army hanging out all the time. In case you're not paying attention, each of these things is enormously costly. And the text also makes it clear that the way he's financing this is by exorbitant taxation. Last movement of unfaithfulness in his life, he has, get this, 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000. My dear husband said, let me get this right. I won't do the rest for you. expensive to have a harem of 1,000. When you begin to step back from the text, what you get the sense of is that Solomon wants to be like the kings around him. He wants to be a glorious figure, and he's imitating the kings around him. And in fact, among the wives that he brings are wives from other countries. Nothing in and of itself wrong with that, but they're bringing other gods with them. And in fact, into the temple that Solomon builds, idols are brought. So right from the beginning, the temple is defiled. We come out of the other end of the Solomon story realizing that then Solomon, wise as he may have been, was a flawed person who displays his unfaithfulness in two important ways. He's an unfaithful shepherd of his people because of the way he oppresses them with taxation. And he's unfaithful to God because he brings other gods, idols, into the very temple that he's building to the honor and glory of God. Lest you think his people are not paying attention, when he dies, the United Kingdom of Israel, which has only been united for 2 kings now. Saul had not united the 12 tribes. David was the one who united the 12 tribes into a unified country. Think American history here, right? Right? Articles of Confederation, remember that time period, right? When we were more sort of independent states than a nation. That's sort of the Saul period. Once the Constitution is made and the states ratify it, you get a unified United States. That's kind of the David period. If you fast forward, I hope I'm not going to step on any northern or southern toes here, to the 1860s, this United Kingdom, this United States, divides again into a northern and a southern nation. The same thing happens in Israel upon the death of Solomon. David is of a tribe of Judah. Judah is the southern part of Israel. So the 2 Judah tribes stay with Solomon's son, Rehoboam. The 10 northern tribes say, the heck with you, we don't want oppressive policies, we don't want taxation, we're going to have another king. Doesn't really work out very well for them. Their king turns out to be pretty oppressive too. And the united Israel divides into 2 separate nations, confusingly called Judah in the south and Israel in the north. From that point forward, until Judah-Israel is conquered by first basically Alexander the Great's folks, and then later by the Roman armies, Israel's really never unified again. It's split into these 2 nations. And to give you a preview of what's going to be enormously important for the prophetic literature that we're going to be reading in coming weeks, these 2 nations eventually each get sent into exile by conquering empires that come and overtake them. First, Israel in the north gets overtaken by the Assyrian Empire, and they get sent into exile. They never really return. These are the 10 lost tribes of Israel that you may have heard of, right? Presumably what happens is they go to Assyria and assimilate and are no longer Jewish. They're worshippers of Assyria's gods, and they never come home. Judah persists for a while, but then the Babylonian Empire comes and overtakes it, and in the year 587 before Jesus, they get sent into exile to Babylon, the so-called Babylonian exile, which lasts for about 100 years. They do come back, and that's another story for later in the winter, springtime. What we find, if you tried to read, you had a huge reading assignment this week. If you tried to read it all, I hope you were kind of skimming, Because what you find out is that the text treats most kings, rather cursorily. There's not much said about most of them. And they're either described as faithful or righteous on the one hand, very, very few of those, or unfaithful and unrighteous, many, many, many of those. And you get page after page, generation after generation of, this king that was like that, and that king was like this, and so on. I'm not going to go through all of that. You get the basic picture. Very few faithful, many unfaithful. At the center of our reading for this week, besides Solomon, is a famous royal couple and their prophet. Remember, Nathan was sort of David's prophet. You may have said to yourself, Solomon's problem was he didn't really have a prophet. And he doesn't. Solomon doesn't have anybody who will speak the prophetic truth to him. If you heard a sermon that I preached a while back, it's dangerous not to have a prophet in your life. We all need friends, even enemies, to be a prophet to us. Parenthetical here. If you've ever wondered why Jesus said to love your enemies, sometimes your enemies are your prophets. Love them. Keep them close at hand. They'll tell you a truth that others may not tell you. So the famous royal couple, are King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. I mean, the name that has come down in Western literature, in infamy, exactly. She's sort of, after Eve, she's sort of the symbol of bad woman. Now, my personal view is that the text probably gives her an unfair deal. In other words, it probably exaggerates how bad she was. Stories are told like that, right? How big was the fish? Well, it was like this. How bad were they? Well, they were like that. But there's a problem with Ahab and Jezebel, which will begin to sound familiar to you. Ahab, there's not a lot of information about this, but Ahab is an oppressive king. He is greedy. He is taxing his people, and in a time of drought and famine, he's doing nothing about it. Think back to Joseph. Remember the great figure from the past who rescued Egypt from drought by wise economic policies? Ahab is not like that. He's sort of the shadow side, the other side of a figure like Joseph. So in a time of drought and famine, God raises up a prophet to speak to Ahab and to Jezebel. Oh, the Jezebel problem is, the Jezebel is the daughter of the king of Tyre. Remember Tyre? That's where all the goods for the temple came from. Tyre is in present-day southern Lebanon. It was a port city. It was very wealthy. She's the daughter, and Tyre, of course, is not a Yahweh worshiping people. They worship other gods, and the title that the text gives to this god that she worships we usually pronounce this Baal. And sometimes it's actually plural, because what the text seems to do is to treat the many gods, the many fertility gods of other countries that surrounded, nations that surrounded Israel, Judah, treat them all under one title, though they had different names, depending on where you were. If you remember your training in Greek and Roman mythology, right? It depended on where you were. Was it Jupiter or was it Zeus, and so on, right? They represent more or less the same thing, but depending on where you are, they get different names. Well, the text summarizes these gods under the title Baal, or Baal. I'm just going to say Baal for simplicity's sake. Two problems. One, the most obvious, unfaithfulness. The God who has formed this nation has been abandoned. If you want to think about this in personal terms, this is what I referred to in my sermon this morning. You know, you wake up one morning and the person that you loved has turned against you. Friend, lover, spouse, boss. You had a covenant with each other, right? And the person turns against you. That's, by the way, how often in Scripture this is portrayed. God had married the people, and they had become unfaithful. So that's the first problem. The second problem, which this part of the text doesn't deal with a whole lot, but when you get to the prophets, the writing prophets, you hear more about. It is pretty clear that a lot of these gods that go under the title of Baal or Baal demanded human sacrifice. Violence writ large, right? You want to be in God's good graces? Don't bring your son to the temple and dedicate him. Kill him. You can understand why the prophets railed against this. Not just because Israel has been unfaithful. I'm using Israel as for both Judah and Israel, right? Not just because Israel has been unfaithful, but because the practices that come with that are life-threatening. Quite literally life-threatening. Cast your mind back to the Abraham story. Abraham and Isaac, remember that? What's pretty clear is that Israel probably, in its past, had sacrificed children also. The Abraham story is partly about Israel's realizing that God doesn't demand that of them. It's a huge realization. God doesn't want you to bloody yourself. Let me say that again. God does not want you to bloody yourself. To go and serve other gods who want you to bloody yourself is a bad choice. And it is Elijah's task to come and talk, I put that in parenthesis, to talk to Ahab and Jezebel about this. What is a prophet? For many of us, sort of in everyday street parlance, we think of a prophet as somebody who predicts the future. That is not what a prophet is, okay? Let's be really clear. Prophets do not predict the future. There may be future consequences of what the prophets are talking about, and they may point to those. What the prophet is called to do is to listen to God about what God thinks about the present, and to speak to that. So the prophet is first a listener, a profound listener to God. What does God think about what's going on in this world of ours? And then someone with the courage to speak. It is an uncomfortable task. Both halves are uncomfortable. The second, of course, more dangerous than the first. Bless you. Elijah listens and hears God say, Ahab and Jezebel have got to go. And so do the priests of Baal and the worship of Baal. It's got to end. And so there is this fascinating story. It's humorous at one level and chilling at another level, about a battle between Elijah as God's representative and the priest prophets of Baal as sort of Queen Jezebel's and the god Baal's representative. The story goes like this. Basically what Elijah does is to challenge the priest prophets of Baal to sort of one-on-one combat. I'll represent God, you represent Baal. Whoever wins out, that's really God. And the reason they're doing this battle is to end the time of drought and famine. In other words, this isn't just a display of power. It's to do something good for the people. So Elijah says, y'all get to go first. So they slaughter a bull, put it on wood, and they walk, well, actually it says there's a limping dance. This is part of the humor of the story. It's like they can't quite do what the people did around the Jericho, you know, when they can't quite get their dance together is kind of the picture. They limp around the altar over and over again, and it says from morning until noon they call upon Baal and nothing happens. So Elijah says something like this. Well, maybe he's gone on a trip somewhere. Or maybe he's taking a nap. Or, my favorite, maybe he's relieving himself. You think Scripture isn't funny? You haven't read far enough. So they take the next step, which again shows you the Baal demands blood. They bloody themselves. They start beating themselves, and blood pours all over the place, trying to get Baal's attention or favor or whatever. Still, nothing happens. Now it's Elijah's turn. Elijah takes up stones and builds an altar that has been thrown down. The implication is that the Baal worshippers have thrown down the altar to Yahweh, the true God. He builds the altar up, so the story kind of slows down here. He builds a moat, a big trench around the altar. He puts wood on the altar. He slaughters a bull and puts it on the wood. And he tells people to pour 12 jars of water on the wood. Not oil, water. 12 is a choice because of 12 tribes of Israel, right? One for each tribe. And water is also a sign of the preciousness of the situation they're in. If you've been reading about Lake Mead drying up, you know, there's not much water around, and they're using water as a sign of what they need. And Elijah calls on God, and fire immediately comes from heaven, consumes the bowl, consumes the wood, consumes the stones and turns them to dust, and dries up all the water. Wow. And then a part that's harder for us. Elijah tells the people who throw themselves on the ground and say, oh yeah, Yahweh's God, Yahweh's God, Yahweh is God. He says, okay, you think Yahweh's God, then go kill all the priests of Baal. Which they do. I can't clean up the text for you, I'm sorry. It's the way it is. So you can imagine what Queen Jezebel thinks of this. She's been publicly embarrassed. Her God has not shown up for the sacrifice, and her priest prophets have been slaughtered. So she goes after, guess who? Elijah. You can't go after God, right? So you go after God's representative, Elijah. And Elijah flees. And we get the reading that you had this morning. Actually, there's some stuff in between, but I won't go into that because we don't have time. You get the reading that you have this morning as our first reading, which is Elijah flees to what's called Mount Horeb in the text. Horeb is another name for Sinai. Two different names, same mountain. And he goes and hides himself in a cave there. In other words, he's petrified. But this is the place where God revealed God's self to Israel, right? This is where Moses got the commandments. And if you remember how God revealed God's self on Sinai, what happened? Well, no, that's at the foot of Sinai. When Moses goes up on Sinai, there's a lot of natural display. Earthquake, wind, and fire. So,
And silence.
Elijah's in the cave. And God speaks to him and says, go outside the cave. So he goes out and he gets to witness all of this. And it says, God's not in the earthquake, God's not in the wind, God's not in the fire. And then depending on whether it's the old translation or a modern translation, the old translations had it, there was a still small voice. The probably more accurate translation, a sound of sheer silence. Now, think about that. You ever been in a place where it was really noisy and then all of a sudden it's quiet? There is a sound to silence, isn't there? No, that was actually Simon and Garfunkel, I think. What this, I think, is supposed to help us understand is that God doesn't always appear the same way. God is either changing, or at least human understanding of God is changing. And we might relate this. Those are pretty violent displays, earthquake, wind, and fire. Sheer silence is not so violent. Maybe the God of Israel, though this God seems to still command some violence, is less violent than Baal. Maybe I'm stretching things a little. You get to decide, and you know what you think about the text. At the very end of the reading for this morning, God says to Elijah, "What are you doing here?" And I think that's probably the right tone. What are you doing here? Don't you remember? I anointed you to go talk to Ahab and Jezebel. Hello? You're not doing your job. Wow. This is a God who is demanding. The part of the reading we don't get is that he tells him, I want you to go back, and I want you to anoint successors to Ahab, and a successor. Ahab, by the way, is the king of the northern kingdom, Israel. And he's told to anoint a successor to the king of the southern kingdom, Judah, and to anoint someone to follow him as prophet, Elisha. If you have ever felt tired of trying to stand up for God, I'm speaking to myself here. If it frightens you and disturbs you and you wish it would just all stop, I hear God promising Elijah, you don't have to be a prophet forever. Your time will be over, and then somebody else is going to have to take this on. That's great solace to me, that I'm supposed to be faithful and even when it's painful, be faithful for a while, but it won't go on forever. It'll be somebody else's job eventually. And to quote a person from Baltimore whom I loved, I've quoted her to you before, we are not called to be successful. We are called to be faithful. Success is in the realm of God, not in our realm. All we're called to do is be faithful, which is hard enough. So Elijah does go back and anoints successors, including a successor to himself. Elisha is his successor. And someone tells Elisha, your master is going to be taken away from you. And Elisha doesn't want that to happen, so he kind of becomes like glue on Elijah. And he actually gets to see this amazing event that is, by the way, a huge image in the Jewish tradition. I'll say more about that in a minute. And a huge image in the Christian tradition, though differently. He gets to see Elijah ascend to heaven. Elijah does not die. He gets to see Elijah ascend to heaven in a chariot of fire. Remember that movie? Chariots of Fire? That's where they get the term. Elijah doesn't die. He goes to be with God. Eventually, not right away, eventually the Jewish expectation that begins to revolve around Elijah is that Elijah will return before the Messiah comes. And there's a tradition. If any of you have been to a Seder, you know this. At every Seder table, there is an empty chair and an empty place at the table. And it's for Elijah. And the door is left ajar. This is the Jewish way of saying, we're ready. Any old time now, God. We would love for there to be a Messiah, because what the Messiah will do is make the world right, just, peaceful. There will not be poverty any longer. Lion will lie down with lamb, right? By the way, both human lions and lambs, and animal lions and lambs. And the Christian expectation that revolves around this begins to associate, as you can see if you read the Gospels closely, begins to associate Elijah with John the Baptist. So that John the Baptist in the Gospels begins to be understood as Elijah returned. Make of all that what you will. What this begins to offer to us, both for Jewish readers and Christian readers, is something that I think is embedded in the human heart, which is, it is painful to live in a world that is broken. And it is painful to live in a world where there is injustice. And there is a yearning in the human heart for it not to be like that. And most of us feel like we don't have much power to do much about that. So Elijah becomes the figure, the image for this hope that it won't always be like this. That in fact God will come and do something decisive. For those of us who are Christians, Jesus is God's decisive act. In case you haven't noticed, there's still injustice. Which means that our expectation either may focus on the return of Jesus, there's stuff said in the New Testament about that, or may focus on the work that we have to do between now and whenever that might be. I can't speak from inside Judaism about the Jewish expectation about this. It would be presumptuous of me to do so. But I believe that at the heart of their yearning for Elijah and the Messiah is the same thing. This desire for the world to be different from the way it is. And the recognition that we need help if it's going to be different. That we can't do this all by ourselves. Well, there's going to be a lot of time between Elijah and Jesus. We've got a lot of history that we're going to have to go through. And God's going to send a lot of prophets to try to speak and to prepare, I think, prepare the world for this acceptance of the yearning that I think really is buried in every heart, and to awaken us to it. And to awaken us to the fact that the change isn't going to happen out there before it happens here. Which is very painful and uncomfortable to look at. But if we're going to be part of the change, it means we have to change. So, listen to the prophets in the text and in your life. If it makes you uncomfortable, you heard me say this upstairs, get in line. I'm uncomfortable too. But the promise of God that we've received in Jesus Christ is that God will be with us in our discomfort. And God will be working for the salvation of the world, the remaking of things. And in the meantime, we do the best we can. And we ask for mercy when we flub it up, which for me is pretty much every day. So, see you next week.